Hello, and before we start today's episode, Allora and I would just like to acknowledge what's going on in the world at the moment with Russia invading Ukraine and basically war happening.
Yeah, I mean, there's not really a lot that can be said about it. It's awful, but what else can you say that it's awful? And we're thinking of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. And we're also thinking of the majority of people in Russia who are against this. This is their family.
Yeah,
These are
they have family, they have friends in Ukraine. They don't want this either.
Exactly. But it seemed a little insensitive for us to just record and post this episode without acknowledging what's happening. And I also have, there's a website called safebo.org, which is an organization. It's a grassroots NGO in Ukraine that is working on helping marginalized people, so people who are queer, have disabilities, that kind of thing, evacuate Ukraine because those people need a little bit extra help. So I'm going to leave the notes and links for that in the podcast description and notes for you guys to check out. And if you can make a donation, that would be great. Otherwise, just know that we're aware of what's going on. We hate it, and we're doing what we can.
Yeah.
Other than that, we hope you enjoy this episode. Hi, I'm Jen.
And I'm Allora.
And this is the Soul Opposites Podcast. Hi, welcome back to the Soul Opposites Podcast. I struggle with that title every time I say it. Why?
You only picked it.
Today is a fun episode. I think we're on episode 5 or 6. I've already lost count, but we're doing well. It's been a few weeks since we've seen each other or since we've recorded. It is now mid-March 2022. Yep.
Tuesday has passed.
Your what was that? Was that 22?
The 22nd of February 2022 was a Tuesday. You
can't make this stuff up. And of course you would be the one to notice that.
Mm-hmm.
We thought it'd be fun just to have a relaxing episode where we get to talk about something we really enjoy.
Yeah.
And the way we're going to format this episode is we're just going to recommend some of our favorite books to you, not necessarily to each other, although I think the books I've picked you would possibly enjoy. But that's not why I picked them. They're just some of my favorites.
You've read at least one of the books I've picked.
Ooh. I'm actually having a really good reading year at the moment. I have already finished 10 books this year.
Cheers. Good job.
Considering last year I only read 26 books in total.
Only?
Well, my standard is between 60 to 75 books a year. So last year was a bad reading year, but I'm doing much better this year. I'm really happy. What about you? Have you had any time to read?
I've half finished 2 books.
Nice.
I read half of The Last Man by Mary Shelley, which I'm digging. But I wasn't really in the headspace to continue something so heady. Yeah. I just wanted something a bit lighter, just, some light fun reading. So I bought Salem's Lot.
That is your version of light reading, yes. Whereas I pick up a queer romance.
I just wanted something a bit more mindless.
Yeah.
And also, when I was because I was Googling all of these ideas and reading Reddit things of book recommendations and everything.
Oh, I love your dedication.
And somebody was saying, Salem's Lot's a really good horror book. I've read short Stephen King stories in the past, and I thought they were just the most trash thing I've ever read. Honestly, it was really bad. The Lawnmower Man sticks in my mind. It's just I don't know if there's some context behind that I'm missing, but I just remember reading it and being like, what and why? But while I was looking up these recommendations, somebody was like, oh yeah, I found it was really touching when they were realizing about the vampires and everything, and everyone got mad at them for spoilers. And I was just like, oh, I mean, is that a spoiler? Okay, I mean, I guess. And people were like, they were saying how, you can't just spoil it. Not everybody's read it. They don't know what's happening. And then when I bought the book, on the cover, it literally said it was about vampires. And I'm like, look, I don't know what a spoiler is to you guys.
That's a few years ago, there was this whole discussion about whether talking about someone's like a character's sexuality in the book was a spoiler or not, because it's like, oh, it like spoils who they get with in the like book or anything like that, you know, people not people alike. And I'm just like, there was this whole thing about like a lot of the people that I follow being like, no, sexuality is not a spoiler. If your plot and your book relies on like someone's sexuality being like a plot twist, you're doing it wrong.
If we were villains, I'm looking at you. I remember reading that and just being so pissed off the whole time.
Is that the one by ML Rio?
Yeah.
I haven't read that. I didn't know it did that. Really?
Yeah. Yeah, so how are we going to do this? Are we going to do one?
Yep,
back
we'll
and
just
forth?
Yep. So you go first, then I'll do one, then you, then me.
Okay, sounds good. So a bit of context for the books I chose and why, because I mean, I guess that is important, huh?
Yeah, yours kind of all have a similar theme to them.
They do. And I can read, you know, a fair bit more variety than this, but you know, I've been a little bit down lately too.
Yeah.
Various reasons, partly like overworked, exhaustion, and just low mood because bipolar, and also low mood because premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Yay.
Oh yeah, that PMDD, we hate it.
Love it. So great. And also like just sort of isolated feelings because working a lot, and I'm often on by myself as well, so it's not like I speak to people much.
Yeah, well, I mean, I got diagnosed recently with burnout from my GP, so I've had to I've been forced to cut back my hours because, you know, that edge of suicidal we don't love that. We don't.
No, we're not here for it.
No, we want to move away from that as much as possible. So I feel you a little bit. So
I've named mine Timmy, the intrusive thought demon, and whenever it happens, I'm like, fuck off, Timmy. Go to the naughty corner for bad demons.
Maybe I should do that. But the problem is, I don't know what's left.
Yeah.
So does that mean these are like your comfort reads?
Yeah, so they're comfort reads, and the comfort reads I pick might seem a little bit weird.
Okay.
But I always think of like, there was this one time my mom and I were watching this true crime show, and there was like a murderer. It was like, you know, a real like
it's like
an interview with him and everything, and he was saying how like he finds horror comforting, and I'm like, look, so do I, and I don't know what this says about me. Okay.
You're like, wow, I really relate to this serial killer.
Yeah, I was just like,
But that's okay. Yes. You know, they're human. You can relate to them. That doesn't mean you're going to go out. You can control the urge to kill people.
Yes. Which, honestly, sometimes you need that.
You work in retail. You definitely need that.
So I found like this really good David Foster Wallace quote, which, him as a person aside, it's a nice quote. So fiction is one of the few experiences where loneliness can be both confronted and relieved. Drugs, movies where stuff blows up, loud parties, all these chase away loneliness by making me forget my name's Dave and I live in a 1x1 box of bone no other party can penetrate or know. Fiction, poetry, music, really deep serious sex, and in various ways religion, these are the places for me where loneliness is countenanced, stared down, transfigured, treated.
Ooh.
And that's why I read a lot of the books I do, because I feel like a lot of more modern books, because I read a lot of old classics, they feel very much more plot driven and more, you know, character and plot, whereas a lot of older books almost feel like the personal musings of the author, like they're reaching out for somebody to like hear them. And in a way I find that more comforting. You're
like looking for human connection, but also I think in a lot of this, you're like inside someone's head. You probably, do you like stream of consciousness? Like writing? Yeah. So that makes sense. Whereas for me, I get very confused.
I remember, I mean, I guess Fight Club would probably count into like that.
Well, it should. Yeah.
But the first time I read that in high school, I was like, wow, this is so different to what I'm used to. I was like really impressed because I was like 14.
Yeah. Well, no, it's a pretty impressive book. It's, if you haven't read anything like it before, reading it is like, when you
read something different to what you're used to reading, it's impressive regardless of what that is, because it's just new. Yeah.
And I do love when people deliberately, by people I mean authors, deliberately play with something like expectations as well. Like that's one of my favorite things as well. If I can't predict the way a book's going, then like it gives it an edge that a lot of other books don't, because I'm very good at guessing where things are going.
See, for me, I almost literally couldn't care where a book's going. I care more what they have to say about where the book's going.
Okay.
So, like, as I was saying with Salem's Lot, I know what's going to happen. I couldn't care less. I'm far more interested in how the characters are reacting to it, how people are feeling, what they're thinking. You know, I know what happens in The Last Man. I looked it up before I bought it because I was like, would I like this? I guess probably. But when I looked it up, I was like, okay, now I know what's going to happen. But from what I've read about the characters, am I interested in their journey through it? Anyway, so my first book, which I'm sure you've guessed, is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley.
I had a feeling that was going to come up. Yes.
Yes. I just find it a really nice book. The whole debate of morality and life and everything aside, I just found it really touching and moving. I obviously really felt for the creature while also not agreeing with the creature. And I don't know, I guess that's probably the point. But also the concept that it was like Mary Shelley basically speaking how she felt, so alienated and so alone and so rejected by everyone and everything, and like speaking that through the creature. And that's comforting to me, I guess.
So for context, would you say because she was a woman in a time that they weren't, when is this set? When did she write Frankenstein?
So like the 1800s.
That's what I thought.
For context, her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, I'm not sure about the
Oh, is
pronunciation.
that her mother?
The huge feminist lady, yes. And her father was like a political writer in some context.
Wow.
I'm going to hazard a guess it's tendency towards anarchist. So she was educated enough to read, which in itself I think was unusual at the time. Very political, very forward, and she came from such an interesting background. And then she met Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, who was a married man but estranged from his wife, but he was married. The two, and then there was all this issue with like funds promised to her father because he was all like, I am rich, but I want to give my money to people who I think deserve it more. And then his parents were like, yo, fuck that. Money's ours, bitch. Cutting you off. So he couldn't give it to her father. And there was this whole drama, and they eloped, and they had like a baby out of wedlock and lived together out of wedlock. And then he was like basically a bit of a man whore. And like just all of this pain and alienation. And the first baby like passed away. And just everything, because she just did not fit into that life. Into that society at the time in any way, far more than a lot of other people. She would have been like a pariah. Yeah. And even the people who were supposed to love her and support her, a lot of the time they didn't. Right. I don't know. And I think all of that, for me, like there's a lot to be said when people, having studied creative writing a bit, and there's all this talk of, separate the art from the artist, or death of the author. Yeah. But for me, that's not possible. For me, I'm reading it because I want to feel that connection to the author. Yeah. For me, reading Lord of the Rings without thinking about how Tolkien was a war vet doesn't make sense.
Right. Yeah. I'm a little bit the same. I like knowing not the angle, but like the perspective that the story is coming from.
And I'm a big believer in like almost like sociology. Yes. Connected to reading. Art does not exist in a vacuum. No. It is a reflection on society, and it reflects back to society. Yeah. And then people, that whole thing of art imitates life. Yes. Life imitates art. Yes. So I think that's something I always take into reading.
I remember when I had to read Frankenstein because I did a Gothic literature course in university because I'm an English literature major. I remember being so surprised. I really liked Frankenstein. That was one of my favorites. I remember being so surprised because, now remind me, is the entire book written in letters or just the beginning and end? Or?
Okay, so the setup. Yes. Without it's not really spoilers. No. So at the beginning, it's written, I believe, in the context of a letter from a man on a ship.
Yes, I remember that.
And then it goes into this, they're like on this big voyage thing, and there's like all this ice around them, and they're like, oh, should we go home? Yeah. And then right there in the middle of this like Arctic wilderness, just ice and water everywhere, almost impossible to pass, they come across a man
Mm-hmm.
And then they come across something chasing him. And then, you know, the man gets on the boat and they hear his story while he's like recovering and all that stuff. And then that's Victor Frankenstein and the creature. And you hear the story almost like secondhand from the guys who found them.
And I remember that being such an interesting way of telling a story.
It is interesting, and I don't think you'd see it much these days. It would be almost frowned upon.
It's so funny the way like modern culture has like taken to the whole Frankenstein thing, because reading the book, I was never scared of the monster.
No.
In fact, the monster to me acts very infantile.
He does. It's like heartbreaking, actually.
Yeah, so you
almost give him the leeway you'd give it like a 5-year-old behaving this way.
Yep, so have you got a quote you want to read out?
I do.
Oh, nice.
But it is true that I am a wretch. I have murdered the lovely and the helpless. I have strangled the innocent as they slept and grasped to death his throat, who never injured me or any other living thing. I have devoted my Creator, the select specimen of all that is worthy of love and admiration among men, to misery. I have pursued him, even to that irremediable ruin. Sorry, my screen's really far away from me. There he lies, white and cold in death. You hate me, but your abhorrence cannot equal that which with I regard myself. I look on the hands which executed the deed. I think on the heart which the imagination of it was conceived, and long for the moment when these hands will meet my eyes, and that imagination will haunt my thoughts no more.
Damn.
Just that whole thing though, like that one bit where you're like, oh, I'm like,
Yeah,
I know.
I was just
you
like,
hate me, but your abhorrence cannot equal that which with I regard myself, which reminds me of a fucking shit post about a mushroom.
What is it about Frankenstein that makes it like your favorite book?
Apart from like the writing style,
yeah, unless writing is like
writing style is a big part for me always, because like that bit I just read out in that one line that I said twice, it's just like sometimes a line just hits hard. You're just like, oh, that's well written. And every time I say that, I think of this damn Drill tweet where he's like, if the zoo bans me for hollering at the animals, I will face God and walk backwards into hell. And sometimes just something that's written effectively sticks with you. Yeah. And I feel like most of that book had that. Also, just my love for Mary Shelley, Goth Queen. What it's about too, like I just... even outside of the context of like how early it was and arguably the first sci-fi and blah blah blah, just what it was about. You know, he creates this monster, he almost makes himself a god to this creature and then abandons it, and just the whole cry of like loneliness and abandonment from the creature, while it's still from Victor's perspective. So for the most part, you're still supposed to be on Victor's side, but it's not that simple. You feel for the creature. You don't necessarily agree with the creature. You're kind of rooting for the creature sometimes, but you just, I don't know, it's just such a beautiful reflection on humanity and those sort of human feelings. It's also the only book I've read in recent years that I slammed out in one day. And I also cried.
Oh, did you really?
I cried.
By the end or like
I cried it a few times.
Wow.
I cried. Lots of crying. Read it in a day.
I'm not sure. Have I ever cried reading a book? I don't know.
I cry reading books all the time. Sometimes I don't even know why I'm crying. I just start crying. I'm just like, that was really beautiful prose.
Are you much more likely to like a book if you cry? It's like, is this a sign that you've connected with it?
Yeah, definitely.
Have you ever read a book that you cried at that you hated? Did you cry because you hated it?
Crying, no, but I did kind of want to throw it across the room. So.
I get that feeling too. Okay, good to know. All right, so Frankenstein, your favorite book?
Yep.
At least for now.
Uh-huh. I have a first edition, second printing
Ooh.
of a Percy Shelley book. I could never afford any Mary Shelley book because people know who she is far more. She is iconic. She was like Goth Queen. You might have seen posts about it. where she was just like apparently lost her virginity on her mother's grave. She learned how to read by like and spell her own name by her mother's grave. She had the calcified heart of her husband wrapped in one of his poems. Like goth queen, coolest person ever. Writes possibly, arguably the first sci-fi as a teenager.
Well, I mean, if that doesn't convince you to pick it up, like, I don't know what will. Because...
And also if you like monsters and horror, because of course that's where a lot of the roots come from. And if you ever heard the phrase gods and monsters, that's actually from Bride of Frankenstein, which is of course from Frankenstein.
Yeah, I mean, if you've ever seen movies that use the whole Frankenstein trope, you probably want to know the source material.
Yeah, exactly. It's actually pretty cool.
Yeah, and it's not like we both read it in one go, so it's not very long either. You can do it, and the writing I think is very accessible. Like
Yeah,
I don't
I
think
do
it's
too.
the kind of classic that people associate with like being really hard to read.
Yeah.
I don't find that at all. There you go. If you're interested, pick up Frankenstein. Right. Well, my first pick is not that old. In fact, it was released in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a sci-fi book, though. It's called The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. Sci-fi is probably one of my absolutely favorite genres, but I don't read it very often.
Yeah.
Which is so strange. And picking up this book, Micaiah Johnson is a biracial author who was raised in a Jehovah's Witness community in the Southern California desert. She graduated high school at the age of 13, received her MFA from Rutgers Camden, and is currently studying race and robots as a PhD candidate.
What?
Yes. In her actual bio, she's like, it's something like her interests are, sipping, drinking tea, and thinking about automatons.
Nice.
And I'm just like, we stand.
Okay.
I believe
Very cool.
She's also queer. But Space Between Worlds, sci-fi book set in like, it's modeled on our world, but it also is like its own world because most of the people in this world are people of color.
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically like at some point in the future, a like genius guy figured out that there were like multiple versions of our world. I forget, like multiverse theory, I think is what it's called. And he figured out how to traverse them, like how to get to them. The problem is, like the catch is you can only go to one of these other worlds if you're like that version of yourself in that world is already dead.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
Yeah. So our main character, Kara, there's 385 worlds that they've discovered because there's more than that, but these are the 380 something worlds that there are.
They have a road too.
They're the most close to our universes that you can go there and you're not like gonna die because it's a world completely underwater. Like it's the closest to our version of Earth, so it's useful.
Livable.
Yeah, basically. And so this guy that found out how to do it, he created a company.
Yeah.
And it's all about, they go to these different worlds. One part is to take things from it because that's worth a lot of money. But actually a lot of it is them getting data to be like, oh, if this political decision happens, how does it affect the population? And it goes into really cool statistics and things. But so our main character, Kara, let's say there's 385 worlds. She's dead in 379 of them.
Oh my God.
So she's extremely valuable because she can travel to the most of the worlds.
Yeah.
And that alone is a really cool concept.
That is.
Jeez. And I thought that was going to be, so in the premise that they sell the book, they're like, okay, she's dead in 379. There's out of 385 worlds. But more of her keep dying, and she's figuring out that it seems targeted.
Yeah.
Why is she the one that's surviving? But I'm going to say this. That premise changes within the first 50 to 100 pages. And there was so much more to this book than I realized. I remember there being a very specific plot twist. And it wasn't even a plot twist. It was a plot reveal.
Yeah.
A third of the way through the book. And I was like, I did not, in hindsight, I was like, oh my God, the groundwork was laid. But I was just so into the story that I didn't even pick it up. And that kept happening. Like, I just was reading this book and I'm like, I have no idea where this is going.
That sounds so compelling.
Oh my God, it was so good. But the best part about it is, one, the writing is like, I really enjoy the writing. It's obviously not Mary Shelley, but it's like perfect for
I mean,
the
things
world
are
it is.
perfect for what they are.
Yeah, but see, the thing is, this book is like a massive sociological experiment, and it comments so much on class, on race. It talks a lot about when you acclimate to something.
Yeah.
But you're doing it to survive.
Yeah.
It talks a lot about like recovering from domestic abuse and how complex that can be when you start taking in multi-universe theories, right? It also has the best female-female relationship I have ever read.
Yeah.
And I've read a lot of queer books, but I have struggled to find like, you know, a good female-female romance that I really like. And this one like did it so well.
That sounds so good. I'm actually super interested.
One of my favorite things about this book, besides the female-female romance and just the amazing world, is it does deal a lot with like morals and ethics and like betrayal and belonging, and it plays a lot with those dynamics. But actually, one of my favorite things is it has the most positive representation for sex workers I have ever read. It basically says that sex workers are way more useful and like better for society than politicians because they like, you know, are the best at not manipulating things, but like, you know, they get the secrets, they do the negotiations, they have the most connections.
That just made me think of Hunger Games. What was his name? Wonderful baby boy. Fennec. How he like basically did the whole you know, basically sold into it, but he gathered secrets and stuff, and that made him like able to have an edge against politicians.
Yeah.
So
yes,
I mean,
yes.
Yeah.
But this was like,
this takes us to this whole new thing. This sounds so exciting.
I know, and like no character badmouths sex workers. Like
that's
everyone,
awesome.
like society basically acknowledges the good they do in the world and how powerful they are. And like, I don't know. Yeah. But it was amazing. It's my favorite book I've read this year. It's probably one of my all-time favorite books. And it's a pretty quick read.
That sounds so cool.
I love it. I don't have quotes to read out, unfortunately. I think I sent you a photo. Hold on.
But we also pick books for different reasons as well.
We do.
So the writing style and like those little moments are super important to my picks, but not necessarily to yours.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just trying to see. I know I sent you a photo, and one of my favorite aspects was talking about like, because in this world, guns don't exist.
Yeah. Actually, you did send that to me. It was really cool.
In the wake of Nelline's revelation, I try to imagine what my childhood would have been like if Nick Sr.'s men were armed. How I would feel if the deaths were quieter, quicker, but more common. I wonder if you feel it less with guns. If so many people are killed with so little effort, is it easier to pretend they aren't lives, that everything is fine? It's different, I imagine, from seeing flattened forms like blood ghosts on the sand or hearing the screams in the streets during the parade. No. Killing should not take longer than a heartbeat. Oh, sorry. No, killing should take longer than a heartbeat. Murder should be unignorable, always. And I'm just like...
so good.
It's like not just the writing, but it's like the point. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the reasons I love sci-fi, is it's such a good way of exploring things that wouldn't be possible in like our contemporary world. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's one of the reasons me and my parents grew up watching Star Trek and loving it, is because you can play with these ideas and not be confined or restrained to like, you know, a world that has homophobia, racism, or even just like the laws of gravity. Right. So I highly recommend The Space Between Worlds The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. Just concept alone, but also it's so well executed.
That actually sounds amazing, and I am keen to read it.
Yeah, and if you want a balance between like good, well-rounded, complex characters who are, a lot of them are morally grey, and even the ones that you would say, like, it plays a lot with, like, who is morally good and who is morally bad, and you just want, like, plot twists and a good plot, but you know, great relationships, like, it doesn't just focus on, like, the romantic relationship. It talks about sibling relationships, relationship with the self and identity, because if you live in a reality where there's 385 of you and so many of you have died, you're like, it makes you question yourself and your value and, like, what makes you different from all those other versions that are technically you. I don't know, give so much food for thought, but I love it, and I want everyone to read it.
Yes, sounds good. Awesome. You've convinced me.
Sweet, I will go out and get you a copy tomorrow. So that means we are back to you, Allora, with your second book recommendation.
Yes, so my second one is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. And
so most people will probably think of the TV Netflix adaptation, I believe.
That's actually where I came across it. I watched that.
I've heard amazing things about it.
It was actually really, really good. And I was like, you know what, I'll read the book. And the book was very different, but also still very good. They're just, if you think of them as different entities.
Yep.
You know, sometimes when they're a book and a movie or a book and show, you have to think of them as, like, different entities to appreciate them both.
Now, I haven't seen the show or read the book, but am I right in assuming it's about a haunted house?
Yes. Actually, the Hill House show was where I got really interested in this idea of, like, a haunted house representing, like, a body almost. And there's a lot of speculation with the show of, like, oh yeah, the kids each represent the stages of grief and all this cool stuff.
Oh, interesting.
So that's not really in the books at all. The book at all. There are some characters that have the same names, but they're not related.
Oh, wow.
It's actually, it's completely
So
different.
they took, like, a lot of liberties.
They took a lot of liberties and just wrote an entirely new thing from the source material.
That can
Both are cool. Really plays with the whole idea of, like, horror being more than just, spooky things.
Nice. Yeah, no, I love haunted houses as, like, metaphors for other things.
Exactly.
It's like, you know, when people read mysteries and they like locked room mysteries because it's like very contained, and, like, the horror is in, like, the lack of movement and the lack of freedom and the, you know, I just find that very fascinating. So
yeah, that is.
It's probably one of my favorite horror tropes is the haunted house, actually.
Yeah, mine too. So in the book, it's a little more focused on basically they've got a group of people together to go to this spooky house because a doctor guy wants to study, like, paranormal, like, stuff, but more to do with, like, psychic things. And he sort of gets all these completely unrelated people together to do that during a summer at Hill House, which is, like, a spooky house.
So they're gonna live there. They're not, like, just exploring it. They're, like, doing an experiment inside the house.
Yeah, basically.
Ooh, that's interesting.
Yeah, that's a very rough description of it. But yeah, it's very interesting, and it kind of has this whole, like, descent into madness kind of thing.
Ooh.
I think what really stuck out to me about it, and I mean, you've read The Yellow Wallpaper, haven't you?
A long time ago.
Yeah, I read it for uni.
That's the one where she's confined to
the bedroom.
She's,
like,
and staring at the wallpaper.
And she's had a baby, so it's probably, like, postpartum depression. Yeah, and you know, like, when you were reading that, you might have been feeling that descent into the madness yourself.
Yeah.
Hill House was like that, and I couldn't really put my finger on why, because so much of it, maybe it was because so much of it seemed so mundane. The characters act so, like, regular while all this crazy stuff is happening. And on one hand, it's absolutely hilarious. Gotta say, I've got some quotes to read out that just cracking me up.
So you think that helps add to, like,
I think
the ambience, I guess?
I think so, because it felt like you almost felt like your own, like, well, for me personally, I felt like my own grip on reality was slipping a little bit while reading it. But I couldn't exactly be like, yes, it was these things and this effect. It was just, it felt so off.
It's like when you walk into a room that you've been into like so many times, but someone has like moved everything like a centimeter to the side.
Yeah.
Like, it's just unfamiliar enough that it like, but you can't put your finger on it. Like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like super subtle, but you know what you're supposed to feel and what you're supposed to expect.
Yeah.
And because like it does that like 99.9%, but then there's just that one little bit that's off.
Yeah.
And that makes you like doubt yourself.
Yeah, a bit like that. Yeah, no, it was just a really interesting read. I've only read it once.
Okay.
So I am hoping to come back and read it again at some point.
Is it like, I know it's classified as horror, but like, are you trying to solve a mystery, or like what's the...
I mean...
Or is it literally just the experience of these people trying to live in this house?
Yeah, basically. It's like a ghost story of just like... Yeah, I'm just gonna... I've got it in my hand here actually at the moment. So... What begins as a light-hearted experiment is swiftly proven to be a trip into their darkest nightmares and an investigation that one of their number may not survive. Acclaimed as one of the finest ghost stories of the 20th century. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, and how fear can make us our own worst enemy. Oh, and fun fact, because, I mean, they kept this part, the bit I'm about to read out in the first page, they kept it in the show, which is cool because it's just... I like it. It's just cool.
Okay.
It's well written, I think. And when I started reading Salem's Lot recently, I also like opened it and it just immediately had that as an excerpt. No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wooden stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone.
Ooh. That's not the style I was expecting, but I know, like
right?
it.
It's just, there's something about it that just grabs you. And then I have a great example of that.
Comedy, hit me.
Okay.
Ow, my finger. I keep clicking.
I didn't hit you, just for
no. I've sprained my finger and I can't click.
Yeah.
But clicking apparently is a nervous tick I do. And I just did it and it really hurt. No, there's no abuse on this podcast. Okay, go for it.
So this is sort of set during like a really climactic part of the story too.
Okay.
So the doctor grimaced and shivered. At that moment, the door swung wide and then crashed shut, and in the silence outside, they could hear the slow rushing movements as though a very, very steady, very strong wind were blowing the length of the hall. Glancing at one another, they tried to smile, tried to look courageous under the slow coming of the unreal cold, and then, through the noise of the wind, the knocking on the doors downstairs. Without a word, Theodora took up a quilt from the foot of the doctor's bed and folded it around Eleanor and herself, and they moved close together, slowly, in order to not make a sound. Eleanor, clinging to Theodora, deadly cold in spite of Theodora's arms around her, thought, "It knows my name. It knows my name this time." The pounding came up the stairs, crashing on each step. The doctor was tense, standing by the door, and Luke moved over to stand beside him. "It's nowhere near the nursery," he said to the doctor, and put his hand out to stop the doctor from opening the door. "How weary one gets of this constant pounding," Theodora said ridiculously. "Next summer, I really must go somewhere else." "There are disadvantages everywhere," Luke told her. "In the lake regions, you get mosquitoes." Like, this is not what you expect during this dark climactic, there's ghosts pounding. "I must go somewhere else next summer." "Well, you do have to worry about mosquitoes at the lakes."
Like, what would you take worst, a haunting or mosquitoes? I mean, honestly, I hate mosquitoes, so I'd probably
to be fair, if we were in that situation, would we not be cracking stupid jokes?
Oh my god, absolutely. That's how we cope with uncomfortable feelings.
Right?
Is humor. That is a very interesting technique, but I think it works. Like, it seems pretty effective, actually.
Yeah, it's entertaining.
I like the juxtaposition of like horror, but then also like mundane kind of reaction.
And that's one of the things that it makes you feel like slightly off center and off balance while you're reading it, because, you know, like even from that bit, there's all this dramatic stuff happening. It's clearly like a big part of the story, and then people are just talking like that.
Do you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of BuzzFeed Supernatural.
Oh my god, yes.
Because you know how like they'll be doing something and like they're building the ambience, and then like most likely Shane will just say something like,
yeah.
Like it makes me think of the episode where they're looking for the Yeti and they're going through the forest at nighttime or whatever. I can't remember the details, but they're like, you know, it's creepy and everything like that. And then they're just like, sit down and have a beer.
Yeah.
And offer a beer to the Yeti.
Yeah. And then there's the classic episode of like trying to get the demons to come out in the house, and it's like, hey demons, it's me, your boy.
Iconic.
I mean, that's almost like watching BuzzFeed Unsolved and reading this book are sort of similar. Like you see characters losing their mind, like Ryan, and then like another character's just making dumb jokes and sitting there filing their nails, and the whole time you're like, what is happening? I'm vaguely spooked, but I'm also very confused and I'm laughing.
But I guess that's cool because there is always going to be people who won't take the situation seriously in these things. Like you see it all the time, like the believers and the skeptics and all that sort of stuff. So I think like as much as it seems a little absurd, I also think it's very realistic.
Yeah.
Which is kind of charming.
Yeah, honestly, I like that kind of thing in books, and I find it very realistic, and it does draw me in. I find it really fun.
Oh.
Yeah, no, I really enjoy it. And again, it's like that whole sort of like the madness kind of thing, and fear makes us our own worst enemy, and all that stuff is I enjoy that, and it was kind of weirdly comforting to read too. What's your second one?
Okay, my second book is a nonfiction book because I love nonfiction. So it's called Ace, What Asexuality Reveals About Desire, Society, and the Meaning of Sex by Allora Jen. Now, I identify as asexual. And the author of this book, Allora Jen, also identifies as asexual. However, our experiences of asexuality are completely opposite. And I love that about this book. This book isn't a memoir per se. It is a book, like as the title says, that explores different aspects of asexuality. Allora Jen did a bunch of interviews with so many asexual people on all different aspects of life, and how they came to understand they were asexual and what impacts those have had on their life. And basically has put this book together to kind of be like, one, to create a better understanding of asexuality, also to demystify asexuality and like disprove a lot of myths that people, or like even just stereotypes that people have of asexual people. And the other thing is also to be like, even if you are not asexual, if you can think about the world like through an asexual person's eyes, it tells you a lot about sex culture in today's world and how it permeates everything. A lot of the people that Allora Jen interviewed are, some are queer, some are not. Like it depends on how you view. Some people view asexuality as being queer, like I do, but some asexual people don't view themselves as queer. But it also, this book deals with a lot of like what it's like to be disabled and asexual. I don't know, one of my favorite aspects, I listened to the audiobook for this one, which was done really well, and I'm re-listening to it at the moment, just because I don't know, I wanted just to feel seen a little bit. But there's some really interesting aspects, like talking about one of the weirdest things about being asexual is we are defined by negativa, which is basically like we have to tell you what we don't feel and define ourselves by something we can't understand.
That's an interesting way to put it. Yeah.
Right? And that's one of the experiences that Allora Jen talks about, is like so many people didn't realize they were asexual. Like Allora Jen was like 13 when she heard about asexuality, and she was like, oh no, I want to have sex, so it's fine. But the thing is, asexual people can have sex and still not experience sexual attraction. And it's so funny because she was like, having a conversation with a friend one day, and she's like, what does sexual attraction feel like?
Mm-hmm.
And the person described it as like a physical thing, and she was like, I've never felt that.
Interesting.
And it's kind of like everyone else is experiencing it, but you're not. But because people just take it for granted, you don't realize that there's like this aspect that you're not getting.
Yeah.
And so then you're like, hey, I'm asexual. That means I don't experience this thing that I have to explain to you, but
that
I don't feel.
But they don't even really think about it as a...
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so funny. And I was just like, that's exactly what it's like. Because like, I don't understand, but I'm building my identity. Well, like part of my identity, this label around something that I don't understand. Another chapter that I really like is talking about toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
And how it's a lot harder for ace men to realize they're asexual because they like it, the expectations for men in sex is so different for women in sex.
Yeah.
One of the facts that Angela Chen brought up that I thought was really interesting was it's very common for asexual men to think that they're trans before they think they're asexual because they think not wanting sex is more of a feminine thing. Right? Because women are supposed to be more emotional and not as driven by sexual desire and blah, blah, blah. Often mistaking like sexual attraction and libido. And doesn't that just tell you a lot about like...
That tells you a lot about a lot of things.
Yeah, but I just
like
find...
toxic masculinity, like the perception around sex.
Yes.
For like genders.
Yes.
And just as a societal thing.
Yeah.
And the way that it's something that... I mean, I was like the part when you were saying she had a friend explain like that sexual attraction and how that physically felt. I was like, you know, if somebody actually asked me that, I'd have to think pretty hard to be able to like pinpoint it.
Yeah.
Because it's not something I would like consciously be like, yes.
So, I don't know. I really love listening to this book. There's a really interesting exploration with asexuality and religion because obviously people often mistake asexuality with celibacy.
Yeah.
And there's also a lot of discussions about, you know, asexuality being like viewed as a mental illness, which is something that I've come across a lot, and like even fairly recently. Like I often have the issue of people not believing me or thinking it's part because I have depression and I'm on antidepressants. They think it's a side effect, whereas I often joke that you can't actually tell what came first, the asexuality or the depression with me. They kind of go hand in hand, and I wouldn't change that. So I really love this book, and I want everyone to read it because I think not only will it help people understand like me and how I see the world better, it'll give you an idea of like most asexual people do not experience the same thing. Like we're all very different and we're not a monolith. The term asexy is used a lot, which I love. And it's really funny because I'm in one of the funniest things to me is I obviously am an ARMY, so I love BTS, and a lot of people have like, I don't know how to explain it, but I have just like funny reactions. I always feel like I'm reacting to BTS different than a lot of people because
you're not like fangirling in that way.
I'm not in it for the sex appeal. Like I can be like, that is aesthetically pleasing and I think they are like asexy because I don't want that. You know what I mean? It's very bizarre, and it's being in fandom culture.
Yeah, fandom culture is like huge on just like lusting after people / characters.
I mean, I don't want to overgeneralize. I think fandom culture actually,
there's a lot more to it, but there
is an aspect of that, and it's just really funny to me, and it always makes me feel like not different because I know there are a lot of people who are in it for other reasons, but it is one of those things where I'm just like, as an asexual person, I'm just like, are we talking about the same thing when we do this? And I love this book for that. Also, a lot of people who've reviewed this book have said that it's made them reflect on how they view sex and romance and like attraction and libido and like analyze how it impacts their lives, because it does impact everyone's lives, whether you feel the sexual attraction or not. So I highly recommend ACE, what asexuality reveals about sex, desire, and society. Desire, society, and the meaning of sex.
That sounds really cool.
Yeah, I love it.
It just reminds me of the time, because like we have a lot of LGBT/queer, depending on how they identify, friends.
Mm-hmm.
And it just reminded me one time, like my mum for whatever reason was like being like, okay, so like, this person's gay and this person's lesbian. I'm like, yep. And then my mum stops and goes, what about Jen? I can't really see Jen being in any particular way. And I'm like, yep.
It's so funny. My cousin once told me she sat down with her dad one day, and her dad, because she hadn't been in a relationship or anything like that, and her dad was just like, so, are you like into girls? And he's like, that's fine. And she's like, no, not really. He's like, are you like Jen?
I like Jen. I like how you're just like the pinnacle of asexuality to so many people.
The funny thing about it though is like people will be like Jen, and everyone knows what they're talking about. And I don't know. I should feel uncomfortable about that because like I'm not a monolith. I'm not the ace experience. But instead I'm just really proud because a lot of people knew I was ace before I did.
Yep.
You were the person that told me what asexuality was. And I went around and we even had a debate with our science teacher in high school because he was like, no, asexuality means you produce on your own and blah, blah, blah. Which,
guess what? Language changes.
Wow. Language can have more than one meaning. But I used the term asexuality for years before actually having the realization I was asexual.
Which is just so funny.
It's also very me.
So Jen is asexual, aromantic, and non-binary.
Yes.
So I like to say that society just kind of handed Jen like sexual and romantic orientation and gender, and like Jen just kind of awkwardly put it on the ground and said no thank you.
Yes. I did, because I just at one point I really thought I was agender, and that sent me down like an existential crisis because I was because I was just like, I can't be asexual, aromantic, and agender. That's just too much.
Too many A's.
So yes, that is my second book recommendation.
Here we go.
Please read it.
It sounds actually fun.
And if you know any asexual people, recommend it to them too.
So my third pick is Picnic at Hanging Rock.
Ooh.
By Joan Lindsay.
This is an Australian classic.
It is.
I love it.
So again, I got onto this book because I watched the TV show. This one, the one with Natalie Dormer.
Oh.
I really liked it.
I haven't seen that.
I think I was.
Is it a miniseries or a movie?
I think it was a miniseries.
Cute. I like Natalie Dormer.
Yeah, I was just like home alone for a few days at one point. And I was like,
That always means a horror
background
binge.
noise. Yeah, basically. So I just started watching it almost more just for something to do, and I just got sucked in, and it was just I was like, you know what? I actually really want to read the book. I think, I don't know, for whatever reason, it had just never appealed to me, and I really just watched it because it was there.
Fair enough. Yeah, it's a classic, even though I know of it, and I think is it set in Brisbane?
No, it's set at Hanging Rock.
Where's that? Is that in Sydney?
I'm pretty sure.
Okay. Wow, I really don't know that. But like I know of it as an Australian classic, but I have never read it.
And that's one of the reasons that I'm personally recommending it, is because when it comes to art that comes out of Australia, there's this long-running thing of cultural cringe. And we have a few pieces, you know, historically that have been considered like good enough to be noteworthy. And those are basically ones that pay as much homage as possible to the motherland of Britain.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole thing.
Yeah, there's a whole thing to get into there that I'm not getting into right now. But I just really like seeing things set where I live.
Yeah.
It's just nice. Like,
am I right? Is Picnic in Hanging Rock like set in like 1930s?
I think it's actually set like way even before then.
Oh, really?
And yeah, basically fancy boarding school by a woman with mysterious past, and then on Valentine's Day some of the girls go missing, and then just like trying to find them, and all this weird symbolism. And I mean, I've seen it described as it's like being in a dream state,
like the
like
writing.
The whole thing is like nothing really quite Halloween, but in a dream, nothing makes a lot of sense. And you'll see something and you're like, oh, that's this thing, even though it makes no sense, but it's just how it is in the dream. The whole book kind of feels like that.
Ooh.
And it doesn't give you a lot of context, but it gives you enough to wonder about, like, different characters and what happened next. Where did this person go? But you kind of wonder, but kind of accept it. And the whole thing is just like this weird dream state, like trippy experience, while also being very pretty somehow, despite, it always feels pretty to me, which is weird because I don't generally associate the Australian wilderness with that. But there's just something about that. Like, picture that scrubby bushland, dream state, pretty dresses, missing girls. And then, where did they go? Why is there this weird swan following this guy around?
What?
Yeah, no, it's like, it's all over the place in a lot of ways, but it makes sense the way dreams make sense.
I love that, though. I looked it up. So the book was written in 1967. Yep. However, it's set in 1900. Yeah. Which is interesting because Australia became Australia, the Federation, in 1901. So this is actually set pre-Federation.
Oh, there
so
we
Victoria
go.
Probably would be where it, like, the Hanging Rock is, would have been considered like its own little settlement because Federation was when all the states became together to be like one thing. So that's I didn't know that. Apparently, there's a lot of rumors that it was like based on a true story, but apparently it's like not completely fictional.
But actually, what happened was, for whatever reason, what I've heard anyway has happened, is that it kind of got quite popular, and a lot of people, and it's also got parts in it that were written as like news reports, but they are part of the fictional story. But people, I think, got it into the head that it was real.
Oh, I love that. Good job, writer.
And there was like this unwritten, like unpublished ending that's like quite different. And the whole thing is just surreal and cool. And even though it's like, wow, people are going missing, people are dying, bad things are happening, there's fires, and you kind of almost want to be there.
Like, what do you think is giving it that particular feel?
I'm going to have to guess it would be the writing style.
Okay.
I think it's a little hard for me to say from the reader's perspective, funny as that sounds. Because for me, when I'm trying to get into that space to write things with that vibe, it's a feeling that I have to be in when writing it. It's almost like channeling it. But then I feel it when I'm reading Picnic at Hanging Rock, where it's like, yeah, I feel so sucked into it. But I also, I'm whatever the author was doing to keep that feeling up, besides things like weird symbolism and, the very obvious things, more just in the word usage is what I'm saying, is I couldn't really pinpoint what it was exactly.
Yeah. I understand. It's not like, oh, it's using this particular technique and all that. It's just like is it written like stream of consciousness, or is it like...
No, it's not. It follows different perspectives of different people.
Interesting.
Third person. It feels like a vintage murder mystery without, I guess, the murder. I mean, people went missing, but all of that, there's a lot of speculation around that too, and nothing ever really... That's another cool thing about it. Like, there was an ending that she had written that explained what happened. And then I believe she was encouraged to leave that out, so it never is solved.
Ooh.
And somehow that's even better. Usually I will hate that. Like,
it kind of works for horror though, doesn't it?
Not always. I still, with horror, I don't like loose ends usually.
Right.
Like, I know people will be like, oh yeah, but it was so clever because the spinning top thing, whether it fell was...
Oh, yeah.
No. But I'm like, I get that, but I don't like it. Give me an answer. I'm sorry. I like my endings tied up neatly. But something about Picnic Rock, so dreamy and mysterious and a little bit magical and surreal, it feels better without an ending because it makes it feel like it's seeping out into life a little bit.
Ooh. I love that. I love that you're representing some Australia, because none of my books, I think, are...
Yeah, but that's probably the most diversity I have.
as long as you're aware.
Yeah, I mean, they're women, but
if you,
one is Australian, but there's not much diversity beyond that, honestly.
But if you pick up my books, you'll be like...
Exactly.
Because Angela Chen is Asian American, but I think Chinese American, and obviously asexual.
Yeah.
And then Space Between Worlds is written by a biracial, possibly bisexual, but at least a queer woman.
Yeah.
And then the last book that I'm going to recommend is written by a Latina. She was born in Uruguay, and I believe is also queer. Her name is Carolina de Robertes. I can't do it with a Spanish accent. I'm sorry. And the book itself is The Gods of Tango. And this is like a historical fiction book set in like 1930s. I'm not 100% sure, but like back then, Buenos Aires, which is the capital of Argentina, in case you didn't know. And it follows... Well, actually, how do I explain this? Okay, so this book explores gender in a really interesting way. I'm going to use the main character's name at the end of the book and their pronouns from that. But actually, there's a huge shift. So at the beginning of the book, we have a character named Lida, but I'm going to refer to them as Dante. So Dante grew up in Italy and had to get... for circumstance reasons, had to get married to a like distant relative who lived in had moved to Argentina. So she has I'm going to use he. He has a marriage by proxy, which is really interesting because his father stands in as the groom, and they do this, and then Dante moves to Argentina.
Yeah.
Arrives to meet their husband and finds out that their husband is dead.
Oh.
And they have no money to go back to Italy.
Oh, no.
They have like no one to provide for them. They're sort of just in this like crazy limbo of like, oh my God, I'm in a new country. I don't even speak the language. What do I do?
Yeah.
And they get like a temporary housing situation, but it's not ideal.
Yeah.
And the thing is, Dante loves playing violin. But because they're female, they're not allowed to, like, that opportunity is really slim. But in Argentina, there's this music style that's like up and coming, based on a mix of like African music, African instruments, and like the Congo drums and everything, and like the new immigrant sound, called tango. Yeah. And Dante learns how to play like this music, but because they're a woman, they're like, I can't follow it. Yeah. So Dante decides they're going to bind their chest, basically do a Mulan thing where they just go into disguise as a male, and become like the most famous like tango violin player.
That's so cool.
But in the process, as the book, like the journey of the book, they start identifying with the male, like the male way of being. And so they go through this really interesting exploration of gender where, you know, at the beginning they use female pronouns, they use their female name, which it feels appropriate because that's like their limited understanding of themselves. And then in the middle of the book, while they're living like this dual life as both Lida and Dante, it's really interesting because it switches pronouns even in the same paragraphs.
Oh, wow.
Because it's symbolizing this like difference of circumstances and gender and how you perceive yourself. One of the interesting things that is explored in the book is like, obviously once they start expressing and identifying themselves as Dante, a whole new world of privilege opens up. Yeah. And they suddenly have all these opportunities that they didn't have before because they identified as female. But then there's a lack of privilege because of certain aspects, like they can't go to the bathhouses, which is like a cultural thing there, and like what happens when they get their period, and like it's so cool. And it does explore like queer relationships with women and stuff like that. I don't know,
that sounds amazing.
It's so good. And there's like, I think the way the book is like starts and the way it ends is really interesting too. It's one of those things where like it starts at the end.
Yeah.
And you're like, how did we get here? What's going on?
Yeah.
And I loved that. But it also, you know, you get the history of Argentina and like the different type of people that existed then, and like the fortune and misfortune people had.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a really cool book. It taught me a lot about the history of Argentina. It taught me a lot of the history about tango. And it's really interesting the way music is in this book, because I heard someone say that music is one of the hardest things to write about because it's such a like emotional thing, and it's really hard to put music into words.
Fair? That's interesting.
Yet I think it's like tango isn't really the words spoken, it's the way the music is.
Yeah.
And I find like it was handled really well in this book.
That sounds so cool. And I like the changing up of the pronouns, and it would be so interesting to read a character transitioning through the course of a book and how that would read. Just like from the perspective of using the pronouns and the name and everything.
And I've read a lot of reviews from trans people who've read this book, and I haven't found a review that says like the representation was done badly. Apparently it's done really well. And the author, Carolina, both lived in Italy and Argentina 4 years just specifically for this book.
Oh, wow.
Which I'm just like, wow, that's a lot of privilege, but also good on you. Dedication as well. And like, I think that helps add to, even though she isn't Argentinian, I don't know if she's Italian. And as far as I'm aware, she is not trans, non-binary or trans-binary. But she's obviously done her research, because everyone says it's done really, really well. Like even the things like, you know, the pain of like binding your chest and everything is like handled well. So, I really recommend this book. And like, it's all fiction. Like, it isn't based on like a historical person, but
people did do that on occasion.
Absolutely.
So.
Queer people have always existed. Trans people have always existed. And it's really interesting to think about, as much as it's really hard and risky to be trans today, it was equally so back then, and the struggles both can be really different, but also there's like a common thread there. But overall, like, I don't want it to make it sound like the book is sad. The book is actually quite a bit about joy.
I was gonna say,
and like finding yourself,
uplifting.
And and the like queer romances are really good too. So I didn't mean for all three of my books to be queer, but that is very on brand for me.
On brand for you. That was really fun, and I had a great time hearing about the books you recommended. They actually all sound so interesting, and even though we like very different types of books generally, I do think I would read them.
Good. I hope
they
so.
They sound really interesting. So
sometimes I'll like read a summary about a book and I'm like, oh, that doesn't sound that very interesting. But then when someone starts talking about it, I'm just like, I need to read that. So even if you only pick up one of the books, like you've got 6 books out of this episode, even if you only pick up one of them, I think you'll get a lot out of them, no matter what it is. And if people like this episode, we're hoping to do like turn it into a series, and you know, every few months do an episode about more books.
And then like every single time we'd be like, so what did you pick, Allora? So I picked Frankenstein.
Do we need to put a ban on Mary? Like,
no repeating books.
But you could do another Mary Shelley book. You could do The Last Man next time.
If I finish reading it.
All right. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Soul Opposites podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope that you love reading like we do. And even if you don't, that's fine. Just pick up a book. Pick up a picture book.
Yeah, pretty much. Or like do, you know, whatever. Manga, comic books. People have their
webtoons online.
Yeah, exactly. People find things you enjoy and enjoy them
however you want to. Also, audiobooks count as reading. Some people don't agree, but I do. It is.
Do podcasts count as reading? Can I count that as reading?
Yeah.
If they're fiction.
Even if they're not.
True. I mean,
you listening to this podcast is like reading
you are
a
reading
book.
by listening to us. Congratulations on reading our podcast.
Oh my God, we end up doing an episode just about like, what is reading? What does it involve? Oh my gosh.
I was trying so hard not to make an inside joke from earlier. What is a man on a horse?
Oh no.
Yeah, anyway.
All right, we will see you in the next episode. I hope you have a good morning, night, evening, day.
And in the meantime, ponder, what is an episode?
You just ended an episode with an inside joke.